Welcome to the Great Woman in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. I'm Mary Shirley, and today I'm pleased to welcome Rachael Pashkevich Koontz to the show. Rachael, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Please would you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. It feels like such an honor to, be a part of this podcast because I know the great women who have been on the podcast before me. So it feels like really exciting to be in their company. Hi, I am Rachael Pashkevich Koontz. I am Senior Associate Counsel for Cybersecurity and Compliance at a DC-based tech company. And I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't say that everything I'm about to say is based on my personal opinions and insights, but does not reflect the opinions of any current or former employer. But yes, I work at the intersection of cybersecurity and compliance for companies. It's my sweet spot.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we are going to have a big focus on cybersecurity today, get a little bit in the weeds, and keeping in mind that a lot of our listeners are not 100% dedicated to cybersecurity. It's a hat that many wear, or a hat that doesn't sit on compliance, but perhaps like ESG or data privacy, something that we liaise with other departments about. So we've got various interests in cybersecurity, and taking into account many of our listeners will not have the same expertise as you, though there, I'm sure, are a sprinkling of cybersecurity pros who have tuned in for this. So welcome to everyone. We're going to try and keep it as applicable across the board as possible. And if you've been listening and you liked some of the topics or would love to hear more about them in more detail or in a different way, don't hesitate to write in to Lisa or myself with your feedback. So Rachael, I'd love to hear, we're during a busy period. I know that in the pandemic, there was a large increase in terms of cybersecurity attacks were reported at the beginning of the pandemic. So let's talk about now, as we are early stages of 2022. What would you say is topical right now? What's going on in the cybersecurity world, and what are some of the key updates we should know about?
Yeah. So kind of reflecting on the previous year, 2021 was the year of ransomware. And this is not to say ransomware had not previously occurred, but it was really top of mind because of the big attacks that went on. It was in the news. And with everyone working from home in that year, everyone was a little more cyber aware. So for anyone who's listening, who's not particularly familiar with that, ransomware is a type of malicious software that is used to block access to a system. Sometimes they will threaten to publish the information. So kind of in your mind, think of it like someone puts a new lock around your system or something important to you, and they have the key. So that is ransomware. And the reason why I think it also is buzzy in headlines for many reasons, but there are just so many aspects to consider with ransomware. So, the number one question is, do you pay? Hopefully this doesn't happen to you, but that's the first question is this something we're going to do? And even in that part, there are complications if you end up paying a ransomware to an OFAC, sanctioned company. You may not realize the group that you're paying the ransom to is part of that. So you might be violating some U.S. law. And I should caveat, I'm approaching this from a U.S. perspective. So there are those aspects to it. What does your cyber insurance say? So it's also very important, whoever is in charge of your cyber insurance for your company, they should know whether there are any particular rules. Some cyber insurance say we don't pay for that. You don't have coverage for that. So you want to be aware of those things. And then perhaps the more, real but heartbreaking aspect is, it depends on what type of business or company you are, because there is currently a lawsuit, for example, in Alabama for a couple who is suing a hospital because they allege that the hospital was undergoing a ransomware attack while the mother was induced, and the hospital didn't have access to all of the usual data and connectedness because it was undergoing an attack. And the doctors allegedly missed some key information that was related to the baby's heartbeat and the cord being wrapped around their neck, and the baby's unfortunately died. So the couple is suing the hospital, say, you should have told us, we weren't fully informed. So this is not the first attack we've seen on hospitals, schools, other, key infrastructure pieces. So it used to feel like a far off thing, like only certain companies get hit with it. And I think what we've really come to realize is everyone is a target for their own reason. So that's a really scary one, but compliance, never waste a good crisis. So if you're hearing about it for other companies, it's an excellent time to go through the thought experiment. They're often called tabletops in the cybersecurity world of what if it happened to us? What is the first thing we would do? What is the second thing we would do? It's an excellent time, especially, we're still at the beginning of the year in 2022 to say, to sit down and plan out the rest of the year and walk through those things. And do you feel prepared in certain areas? Is your comms team ready? It's an excellent time to, reassess where you're at. So I would start there. Any thoughts about ransomware from your perspective?
Yeah, so one of the things that my understanding is that even if you pay in a significant number of cases, you still don't get the data back. So when you're doing those tabletop exercises, I think you need to be prepared as one of the questions. If we decide to pay, what are we going to do if they don't give back that information? For a company like mine, we're in healthcare, and how to say it, I guess the egregiousness of patient data going out may not be as important to some people as other categories of data. And so there may be varying values based on the type of data at stake. So for me, it's knowing that it's really uncertain, this situation, and that even if you make the decision to pay, you may not in fact get what you want.
Yeah, and it's definitely, like you said, it's a tough decision. And it's something you hope you never have to do, but you need to prepare yourself now. I think we've all had a come to Jesus moment that it could happen to me. You could no longer put your head in the sand about it. So I think that, if we try to look for silver linings from this pandemic and everyone working from home, it has, made people somewhat more, closer to their technology, a little more aware of it. And you say, hey, that could happen to me. So we should think about it. We should prepare. And then, some other key updates are, I think there are some areas of cybersecurity that seemed really above and beyond a few years ago that are now expected. So what we often see in a lot of these ransomware and other cases is that if you just had someone's username and password, you can log in as them, have access to everything they have access to. So now, we hear multi-factor authentication or MFA, single sign-on, SSO, all these components that were like, oh man, you must be a real tech company to have all those things. Now it's expected. And it's tough for smaller companies or older companies. These are things they have to invest in, but these are becoming the new normal. And they're things we do have to get comfortable with. Now, I'm often on the change management side where it's difficult to change all of these habits, but I think what's really neat, one of the things I enjoy about cybersecurity is the things that you learn and teach people at work to be more aware and, in their role, they get to take home with them. So for example, I first learned about password managers a few years ago from my coworkers who were much more technical than me. And they're like, Rachel, you don't have a password manager? Like, come on, get with it. And then I felt very high and mighty when, the public started talking about them because I knew what they were. So, and then, a lot of companies have corporate password manager accounts to help their employees not write down all their passwords and have a single place to put them. So, I know compliance, we're always trying to help people and make things better. And I think cybersecurity does provide a lot of opportunities for people to learn a lot and take those lessons home.
So for the password managers, are there any ones that you would recommend that people look into?
There are quite a few out there, and really technical folks will have much stronger opinions about which one's better than the other. Two of them that I think of off the top of my head are LastPass and OnePass. And again, if you're not familiar with the password manager, I love the phrase one password to end them all. You just have to remember your password to the password manager, and then you can store all of your passwords in there. And they often have like a browser plugin. So when you're on a website, it'll pre-populate your password for you. Some browsers do have that built in, such as Chrome has that, but unless you're aware of all the security features, you probably shouldn't use the default password manager, but it's up to you. But I'll be honest, it was life-changing for me to only have to remember my one password, and then it helps with all of my others. So it's such a small thing that I learned from coworkers. It has made a big difference in my life.
whenever I see memes about like forgetting passwords and things, I feel like it's so relatable. And you know how in the world there are all these different people out there. I think very few people are like belong to this category of I'm so great at remembering which unique password I have for which unique website. Like it's just everyone can relate to this.
I have seen quite a few people say, like on Twitter, I just don't have any more passwords left in me.
Yeah, exactly. Those
you
are the
can't
ones.
remember them. Yeah. So like another aspect of a password manager is they actually generate the passwords for you. So you just pick the length and complexity and it will come up with it and it will remember it. So big fan of that. But I mean, I feel like the increased number of passwords is really keeping the Post-it industry alive.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think I use less Post-its these days as a general rule, especially since we got camera slidey things for our laptops. Yes. Yeah, I used to use a Post-it upside down, but now camera slidey things are the preferred tool.
Yeah. I do love, I'm preferential to the little stickers. I love when vendors give those out because my laptop won't sit flush if it has the slider component.
Yeah.
But they sell special like reusable stickers and you can brand them. So I have one on my laptop right now from a former employer because they were so fantastic.
Good. I put one on my my Peloton as well, which is kind of funny because I'm barely on my Peloton. But I was like, of all the sort of ransomware, I think like someone having photos of me sweating it out, red-faced, hair askew on the Peloton, that would be excellent blackmail material.
Or in particular, if it had the audio of you like cursing at the instructor while you're trying to power through.
Singing along off key to the Spice Girls, yes. So, Rachel, does that cover the updates you'd prepared? Or should I move on to the next question, or are you still...
I think, I don't want to be like too heavy in one area because, we'll just approach cybersecurity from a few different areas. So
sure.
I think we'll kind of start with that.
Lovely. All right. So my next question for you is in regards to what at the time was quite a high profile case. It's the Colonial Pipeline one. What are the learnings for compliance officers from that case?
Okay, so for anyone who's listening who wasn't super familiar with the Colonial Pipeline, so they provide almost like half the fuel that's consumed on the U.S. East Coast via their pipeline system, and hackers gained entry to some of their networks via an outdated VPN or virtual private network account that didn't use multi-factor authentication. So all you needed was a username and password, and they don't know how they were acquired, perhaps. But that's all they needed, and they were able to get in. And what I think is particularly interesting is they sat on that network for a week before they issued the ransomware note. So the note really, was the trigger for events, but they were in the system for over a week figuring out what they had access to, what was valuable, what could they download, what could they, hold on to. That's the scary part, is when someone is in your system and you don't know it and you don't know what they're looking at. So they issued the ransomware note. It was promptly reported internally, and the company made the decision to shut down the pipeline to prevent any potential access or misuse of it. According to the company, the system that runs the pipeline itself was not impacted. It was other components of the company, but they shut everything down, and they did pay the ransomware note. So I personally, and I think you too, Mary, live on the U.S. East Coast. So at the time, it was very scary. We're like, will gas go $5, $10 a gallon? Are we going to be able to fill up our cars? It was a really big deal. And again, this is what brought cybersecurity issues to the forefront. So there are a lot of great articles online about this, but one of the first things is, system monitoring. Like if this particular user doesn't regularly check these like certain systems, that it should have tripped a flag that this user was using this outdated VPN and they hadn't used in a long time and they were poking around at things. Now I realize for some folks on the call, that also gets into privacy concerns, like how much are you monitoring your employees and what they regularly do. So cybersecurity usually works hand in hand with privacy to try to find the right middle ground there, but you do need to kind of have a baseline for what a user is usually doing, so that way you can detect any abnormal patterns. A great example example of this is impossible logins. So if I log into my computer in the US and then 5 minutes later I log in from a European country, that should trip a flag somewhere because I can't be in two countries at the same time. So system monitoring, that was a really important thing. Like I said, they were in the system for a week before they realized it, and they only realized it because of the ransomware note. Who knows how long they could have been in that system and used other tactics to try to get more access and do more damage. We don't know. And then, so like system segregation, that was actually a positive in this case. So as mentioned, the hackers, according to the company's reports, didn't actually have access to the systems that could have impacted the pipeline. They proactively chose to shut them down to prevent it. But that's actually a good example of proper segmentation. So if Mary only needs access to systems A and B to do her job, she shouldn't have access to C as well. So that was good. And rapid response. And that, gets back to what we were talking about earlier of like practicing. If something bad were to happen and we have to report it immediately, we have to issue a statement. Are we ready? Do you already have, does your company already have pre-planned blurbs? What social media platforms would you put it on? Who's allowed to say it? What are your employees allowed to say or not say? How are you, I think we could learn a lot from our privacy folks who often have pre-prepared talking points and reporting mechanisms for privacy, but it's not always PII. There's other things that we need to report, and we're often not thinking of those if they don't touch PII. So, sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you.
Yeah. So PII, for those not in the space, personally identifiable information. So we want to be careful of personal data, especially in countries where there are robust data privacy laws in place. The US is kind of an interesting one in this space right now because privacy is an evolving topic area from a legislation perspective, and currently there's no federal data privacy law for, governing everyday data. Excellent. So interesting case, great for your the people in your field, I think, Rachel, despite the negativity, because it really made it mainstream. It made it relatable for people because it affected them in their day-to-day. And unfortunately, we saw a typical of human behavior, similar to the toilet paper issues during the pandemic. People were told, do not fill up your cars if you don't need to. Everyone, of course, ran to fill up their cars in a mad panic. So I guess, if one thing is predictable, it is human behavior sometimes. when you're in a sort of a crisis situation and you tell folks not to act in a certain way, oftentimes we can't help ourselves and we buy a year's supply of toilet paper when that's not really needed.
I think it's similar to saying calm down has probably never calmed anyone down. Saying don't panic has probably never helped anyone not panic. Just using the word panic.
Yeah. Be interesting to hear, from the psychologists, what would be more effective wording. I know in New Zealand, when I was trapped in the lockdown, the Prime Minister would, with a smile on her face, would come onto the TV and say, there is enough food and provisions in the supermarkets if you'll only give them time to restock. I don't think it worked. We're still out of toilet paper, flour, and yeast.
But she tried.
But yeah, she did try, and it would be interesting to hear from the experts, especially if we have any behavioral scientists who are listening in, what you think might be a more effective approach in terms of messaging to audiences during a crisis.
Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention is that, because this was so in the news and such a big deal, obviously had the attention of Congress. So there have been bills put forth that do talk to this issue to, hopefully try to prevent it in the future. So things making the payment of ransomware illegal or other components. Now, that feels like quite the thought experiment. If we make it illegal and you have no options, how does that affect, the hospital who needs its records, whose systems are being held ransom? But there are, some potential bills in the pipeline. Oh gosh, pun intended. About this issue. But kind of as you noted earlier, Mary, the U.S. isn't doing great at publishing a lot of laws lately. We've got a lot of tension. So perhaps we'll see some great movement in other countries and we can follow suit.
Well, sometimes that's all you need. I know that the New Zealand data privacy law, the Act had been put in place in 1993, but we certainly followed in the footsteps of a lot of other countries when putting together our data privacy laws. So certainly helps to have some steady work in front of you to be able to pull from.
It feels like, real quickly, GDPR, when Europe has GDPR, we need something. We can't have it all. We need the CCPA. So, but I will say, as a quick side note, a lot of laws that sometimes say data security laws are actually quite privacy focused, and they'll have fairly generic light language about the security controls that are actually required. We often see language like reasonable security controls for a company of your size, but without better definitions or explicit requirements, we're just going to see it when the lawsuits come to light about what does reasonable mean. So we really need more guidance there. And that's why I think we see so much. I mean, while cybersecurity in and of itself often has a lot of gray, when we're not getting these specific requirements of what's expected, it's really hard to prepare for these types of attacks, such as the pipeline attack.
Well, speaking about, specifics, the next thing I wanted to ask you about is right up that alley. So I wanted to get your thoughts on cybersecurity controls or program enhancements that companies should be focusing on in 2022. So in the absence of legislative direction in this area, what are some of the things that you're seeing as good ideas, best practices, trends? And I don't use the trend in terms of, fashionable. I mean, things that a lot of people have realized are a good idea to put in place. What are you seeing there?
So since most of your listeners likely aren't, dedicated cyber folks, my first question to you would be, do you know someone who works in IT or security within your company? If not, go make a contact. Just like you're trying to spread the compliance word or whatever your focus is, you need to know what's going on from the cyber and IT perspective. So if you don't already have that relationship, regardless of your role, make that a goal for 2022. I'm going to find someone and just learn a little bit about our company, where we're at, what's on their roadmap. Because there's so much overlap between corporate compliance and cybersecurity compliance. So that is my challenge for listeners. And then the other really approachable aspect of it, if you're not in cyber, is take the DOJ evaluation of corporate compliance programs, which is like my Bible, love it. But take the requirements of it and just put the word cybersecurity in front of them. And that makes it, that really, because I think when we talk about cybersecurity, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know what a firewall is. How could I possibly, be an advocate for it? But if we look at the really basic requirements of the DOJ's recommendations, do you do cybersecurity risk assessments? Do you have cybersecurity policies, trainings? Do you have an investigation or reporting mechanism? I think it helps you start to visualize that there's a lot of overlap, and things such as your ethics hotline. Well, do you have a topic there for IT or cybersecurity issues? Are you promoting that that's an opportunity if someone wants to make a report? There's just, I love explaining like a cybersecurity compliance program from that perspective, because it's really easy to see, to build those foundational aspects and then just, add the cybersecurity into them. So I would start there. If you did want to dip your toe into a little more cyber specific stuff, there are a plethora of frameworks, which is good and bad, because then everyone picks their own flavor and argues theirs is best. So NIST, N-I-S-T in the US, the NIST framework for improving infrastructure cybersecurity, it's about a 30-page PDF, and it talks about the specific cyber controls. And it's like, it's written like a manual, so it's easier for non-technical folks to kind of read and understand. But I think that's like half the battle working on the cybersecurity side, is making it applicable and approachable to people, and saying, just like, if you see something, say something. Compliance is truly everyone's job. It's the same thing with, privacy and security. It really is everyone's job. So I'll start there for any thoughts, because I feel like some people are like, it's a new perspective to just put cybersecurity in front of compliance and rethink about it that way.
I think it's a great idea, Rachael, because essentially the framework of a good program of controls is encapsulated in that evaluation. And so it gives you a starting point. So when you ask a question like, have I got training in place? Is the hotline known as being something that people can use for security issues? It's a really great starting point, and it almost acts as a gap analysis for you, because when you're able to say, yes, I have this, or I don't, or yes, I have this, but I've just realized it may not be detailed enough, and I should probably engage a consultant if we don't have anyone internally that's specifically in this role to help tailor this to security risks, then you've given yourself a really great start. So I love that, and I think the NIST framework, something that we're going to see more of. It's gaining prominence, I think, in the United States. So a great reference there. And 30 pages, I mean, yeah, it's a fair amount, but it's not overwhelming and ridiculous. You can get through it with a bit of time. Use it as your starting point. And again, well, aside from budget, but really there's nothing stopping you. If you're nervous after working through some of this stuff, get in a professional to help you, or use it as your business case for why you need a dedicated cybersecurity staff member if your company is at that level of maturity now, where perhaps previously it was considered that a full-time dedicated person wasn't required, but through this work you're able to say, hey, I need someone like this on my team.
So moving beyond that, I was thinking about this question that you put out there, and my recommendation is actually the same, whether you have a smaller company, a newer program, or a more robust one. Start foundational. I've worked at places with much larger cybersecurity programs. You've got a lot of great controls in place, but then when you look back to the basics, something like asset management, do we know how many laptops we have and who has them? And I would venture to guess most companies can't answer that question very well, and that there's a lot of reasons for that. The employee who sits next to you who has his old laptop in the desk because he forgot to turn it back in, but he got the new one. That's very common. But that's a really foundational aspect, because first you need to know, what have you got? And then, okay, are we patching it? Do we know where it's located? If a laptop gets lost, do we know the last time it was updated? So you could really have to start foundational with a lot of things before you can build. So even and I think we're going to see, since we're seeing more, as I mentioned, frameworks, certifications, and things like that, they all start with the foundation requirements, and then you build upon it. A great example of that is the new Department of Defense's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or the CMMC. So for those of us who are U.S. government contractors, or DoD contractors or subcontractors, that will eventually be a requirement for you. So if you are in that space or thinking to get in that space, put that on your roadmap. But they have, their current version has 3 tiers. So depending on how much information you have and other services you provide to the government, there's higher requirements. And I think that's a great mentality. And I hope to see that as the future is a tiered system, because we do need a baseline for everyone. You might say, well, I am a manufacturer of toilet paper. Why do I need to care about cybersecurity? I have very little information. You have employee data. You probably have email lists. You have other components. Also, as we were just discussing, like ransomware, you don't want your manufacturing site to get shut down. So everyone needs a baseline. I think that's what we're really lacking right now, or people understanding those controls. So it's a great place to start. And then if I had to pick my top 3 for 2022, where I'd love to see, awareness, because I think it starts with awareness and looking into it. So as mentioned, asset management. The second would be vendor management. So we saw that with the SolarWinds attacks. It was such a widespread issue because so many companies and government groups were using them. Did you have any, personal thoughts on the SolarWinds attack?
Yeah, thinking about controls for SolarWinds. So that was the one, if I recall correctly, where the former CEO placed blame as to the root cause of that case being an intern coming up with the password SolarWinds 123. So I think even for those of us who aren't cyber specialists, we all know that is probably not a best practice password. Fairly easy in a brute force attempt to come across that one, or even just guess it randomly. So thinking about that as a real life case example, what controls are you giving to people who may not have been trained in this area? So what powers do your interns have? And thinking about the training side, are you training them? Do you have people like your interns on the training list, or have you decided they don't count because they're not permanent employees? So I think the SolarWinds case is a nice one. And then this isn't a control, but I would just comment, I would say not great tone from the top to place blame on an intern as the senior management of a company. Probably not the level of accountability and responsibility we want to be seeing. So not a beautiful example there. But yes, please continue, Rachael.
Yes, agreed. And as you mentioned, what we're blaming the person, but should that person have had the ability to have access? We're getting back to, which would be my third topic, regular user access controls. So in a former company, I've had to improve regular user access reviews, which is a lot harder than you think. What systems, what access does everyone have, and do they need it? Do they need it to do their job? Which is a common control in a lot of cybersecurity frameworks, but it's a lot more complicated to meet that requirement than you think because, especially people who've worked at a company for a very long time. So, I had a coworker, been with the company 15 plus years, had worked in multiple departments. Well, every time he changed location or department, he would still, for a period of time during the transition, help his old team do their job. So they never took away access. So 15 years later, he had access to a lot of systems and a lot of places that he didn't need to do his day job, but no one ever reviewed the regular access review to say, does that person still need access? And that's, when we see these really big breaches and impacts, it's often because of lack of regular user access reviews. What systems do you actually need access to? And then regularly checking them, especially when people change jobs. Because I think companies are great about setting up access when you started a company and taking it away and disabling it when you leave the company. But the main risk is that middle part when you're, switching jobs and helping someone out and doing them a favor, and they give you temporary access, or perhaps they give you admin access to set up a system, and then they forget to, lower you back to a regular person. So we see that, and it's such, like I said, it's such an important control, and it's really painful. But the first time you get it right, you can repeat it. But setting that up, it's painful. It's like trying to think of all the different places you have a password.
That's useful. That. Thank you for that, Rachael. I think that's a great list of priorities there, and I really liked the asset management one. And I'll ask our audience to think about who of you has had to get a new laptop from your company, an existing company, during this time frame, or a new mobile phone. I was still on the iPhone 8 until very recently. It was fritzing out on me. But did you send back your old devices? Because when we were in the office environment, it was hard not to hand over your old device in order to get your new one. Now, many of us are in a situation where the new device is sent to us, and the company probably wants it back for these purposes. But then for pragmatic purposes, you might say, oh, but just in case there's something wrong with the new one, I want to hold on to my old one for, a bit longer. And then did you forget to send it back, or you just didn't continue that conversation and the company's not demanded it? So where are you sitting now with all of these company devices in your house?
And the theme that I'm feeling from what you just mentioned is accountability. Where are we placing accountability? Is it, and we should have multiple layers of accountability, but it's the employee's role to return the device. Perhaps is the manager responsible for all of their employees' devices? Do they need to be aware of it? Is it someone in IT or cybersecurity? So the best case is obviously multiple layers of defense, but that's what I think I'm hopeful for the future of cybersecurity, is really driving that individual accountability. Because topics like asset management, it's so easy to say, well, that's not my job. I have nothing to do with that. It's not my job.
Exactly.
But we all have levels of accountability for it. So, and then the other area we didn't get to dive too much into yet was vendor management. So I think it was in 2020, so a little farther back, we saw some big companies like Jones had, and there was a slew of them, and it turned out the common denominator was a file transfer software that they were all using called Excelion. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but a bunch of, universities were using it, big law firms were using it to transfer files, and they got hit, so that all of the customers using that software got hit. Now, I think what's tough in cybersecurity is nothing is ever perfect. You could do everything every year and try your hardest, and nothing is without certain faults, but there are things you should and can do. So before you have, start a relationship with a vendor, are you vetting them properly? Do you have it's often called like a SIG or a customer questionnaire where you ask them questions about their security posture, and they can be as short as 10 questions. I've seen some that are 300. I've answered both.
Oh my gosh.
But they ask, delve a little into, like, does the vendor require its employees to do security awareness training? Do they do phishing training? Do they have to change their passwords every 60 days? Just so you can gauge the risk level of that vendor. And then it's very common in contracts to have audit rights or other types of rights, but I almost never see companies use those rights. Now, I'll say audits are a pain, they're expensive. If you want to audit a vendor, there is usually the opportunity, if the vendor itself has some sort of certification, like an ISO 27001 or a SOC 2 Type 2 report, you can usually request copies of those on an annual basis just to check that they're passing their audit. So you yourself don't have to do the audit, but there's some faith, since they're having a third party, say, give them the thumbs up. So from the flip side, that does make you more attractive to your customers and make them feel more trustworthy of you. If you have something tangible from a third party, you can show to prove you're doing the right things to the best of your ability. And then, the problem also is people set it and forget it, but we need to regularly touch base with our vendors, in particular, our most important ones. Perhaps they have the most sensitive data for us, or our business relies on them. It's, supply chain aspect of that. So your HR information system, your HRIS, like, that's a really sensitive one. You probably want to do a regular touch base with them and see how things are going. So those are the three areas I highly recommend thinking about for 2022 are asset management, vendor management, and regular user access controls, which again sound scary on their own, but they really are more applicable when we talk through them.
That's awesome. So Rachel, you've given us a really nice run through of some key areas to think about for cybersecurity risk. I'd like to turn a little bit now to a different area of risk and ask you about a risk that you've taken in your career that has paid off.
So it sounds cliche to answer it this way, but a huge risk in my career was taking my first job in cybersecurity. So I do not have a technical background. I have no personal certifications or anything. My background is I was a regular, attorney at a law firm, and grew a little disillusioned with law firm life, as many of us do. And and then I took a break from law, and I worked in the business as a project manager to try to see things from a different perspective. And that's actually where I fell in love with compliance. I Googled careers in compliance, and I found Christy Grant Hart's book, How to Be a Wildly Effective Compliance Officer. I actually had her sign it because I'm a nerd.
That's lovely.
But I learned all about this industry that really is, the intersection of law and business, and the whole goal is helping people. And I just fell in love with it. I mean, I rarely meet, outside of compliance conferences, I rarely meet people who are as passionate about policies. But so I was looking for something in policy and compliance, and there was an opportunity at my former company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, in their cybersecurity department. And I applied to be their policy analyst, and I interviewed and said, I have no background in cybersecurity, but I'm really passionate about policy and compliance. And to their credit, they said, well, we can teach you cybersecurity. We can't teach you to care about compliance. So it taught me a lot. It was an amazing opportunity, and that's where I was in the trenches with all of the different teams, because when you're at a larger company that has a more robust program, you get the really cool opportunity to work with each individual team, as opposed to a smaller company might have a really small security team with a lot of generalists. I got to work directly with third-party management, vulnerability management, patch, our security operations centers, everyone. And it taught me a lot about also hiring people for potential and not necessarily just experience. They hired me, someone with no cyber background, to write their cybersecurity policies, which says a lot that they were like, hey, and I think about that a lot myself in terms of hiring, and it's encouraged me to really be more open-minded about hiring people. who have different backgrounds, because you do get really great output when you have people with different backgrounds in the room. And it's funny when when you're applying for a job and they say only you don't have to have 100% of the criteria to apply, but a lot of people won't look at you unless you meet most of them. So it's really impressive, the organizations who can move beyond that and look for potential and not just experience. But so I have a long-winded way of saying that. So that was my, foray into cybersecurity. I work with every group. I built my own cybersecurity compliance program, primarily based on the ISO 27001 framework. I got that certification for my company. I am a big proponent of cybersecurity certifications because I think there's a lot of value. They're often a nice kick in the butt to hold yourself accountable, and they make customers feel good. But I have it's a new industry when you look for jobs, for cybersecurity compliance. Like compliance itself wasn't something people talked about 5-10 years ago. And now cybersecurity compliance. But I love being the intermediary between the technical folks and then the rest of the business. And as I mentioned before, making it applicable and approachable. But I will sum it up. When I took that job and everyone thought I was nuts, I think you should, try to do things that excite and terrify you, whether it's jumping out of a plane or taking a role in a new industry. I truly do believe in trying to take those opportunities in life.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, when we speak, I can see the passion in you, the excitement, the nerdiness, right? I think those of us who really are enthralled by this can see it in each other, and we thrive on our conversations with each other because we just enjoy talking about this kind of thing so much. And even though I'm one of, though I'm not a newbie anymore, but I'm probably one of the younger set out there, is that even when I first started, which wasn't that long ago in the anti-corruption space, there was, I think, a downwards look upon compliance compared with practicing law for many people. And I'm so glad that didn't stop me, because I truly believe that compliance is my calling. And so when we take these risks, part of it is that maturity growth in terms of just not caring what other people think. Doing what is right by you is so important. And then another thing that you mentioned, I think perhaps at first blush, when you hear a company's like, oh, Rachael's got no experience in cybersecurity and they've asked her to write their policies in it, you're like, if you might, initially be like, that doesn't sound like a great idea. But what's really not a great idea is having, for example, and I've seen this firsthand, a law firm with huge experience in something like the FCPA write an anti-corruption policy that just stinks. It is not user-friendly. It is written for lawyers, by lawyers, and focuses too much on the theory rather than the pragmatics of what people need to do in their actual jobs. I would much rather have a Rachael who perhaps did not had not previously written a cybersecurity policy, who's written it in plain English, it makes total sense, and has taken care to make sure that the right research is in there so that it's accurate, it's sensible, and up to date from a technical perspective. That is far more superior to something that's been written by someone who may have the experience behind them, but their experience just is not right for an in-house compliance program situation. So in that sense, a company took a risk on you, and it really paid off, not just for you, but for them too. So lovely.
Thank you. And I feel like I need to defend them if anyone thinks that they're crazy. So I was the medium who worked with the experts, and I translated their expertise in their different niche areas and I documented the company requirements. So I wasn't just off in a bubble writing these things I didn't know about.
I hope I didn't come across this as indicating
I just don't want any listener to get worried and be like, oh man, you were really unqualified. I mean, perhaps I was a little.
I think,
I got there.
That brings me to a point, and it involves Christy Grant Hart. When our book came out, and you may know, Rachael, the Sending the Elevator Back Down book is a compilation.
Of course, I have my own copy. Yeah.
Thank you. I haven't signed it yet, but
I'll bring it.
And it's a compilation of, a lot of women's stories that are in there, as well as some writing from Lisa and myself. And I mentioned to Christy Grant Hart that I said, I feel a little bit bad about the fact that, I'm being called an author, but I did not write the whole book. And she said to me with absolute love, but in a in a very matter-of-fact way, I never want to hear you say that again. You are the author of that. You are an author. And that was a really great sort of push, one, just for, the support of other women and their accomplishments. And Christy really looking out for me there, and self-confidence. But, just because, you may have your name on something, it does not mean that there wasn't a cast of characters who helped you achieve that piece of work.
Oh, and, speaking of sending an elevator back down. So again, I give a lot of credit for the ability and the opportunities I have now because of that first. And it was a female manager who hired me and took a chance on me, even though I had a non-traditional background, as you would say. And then after I had been at the company for a while and got to hire my own team, I was able to take those lessons. And one of my initial hires was someone who came with a financial analyst background from inside the company. So again, just like me, no cyber background. But the company did these monthly phishing exercises, and our CISO's picture and name was on it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to him. This is, an 80,000 person company. It's very large and international. And she said she wanted to learn more about cybersecurity, potentially, pursue a career. And she emailed the CISO, that's the Chief Information Security Officer, and said, I'd love to, speak with you and learn more about it, and that to me just showed. And then when she applied for a role on my team, I was like, it showed drive. Like, she's interested in it. She's not afraid to say, hey, I don't know anything, but I want to learn more. Where do I start? And I was very, very fortunate to have an opportunity to hire her to my team again with no experience. So to continue to show others that, like, there's room for people with non-traditional backgrounds as long as you have the drive and interest. So
yes.
I hope one day she gets to be a hiring manager and do the same thing for someone.
Yes. I loved how one of the employers that took you on said that they couldn't train you to be excited about compliance, but they could train you about cybersecurity. And I think part of that's the attitudinal thing. Someone who's enthusiastic and passionate and has an interest versus a boatload of experience, I would take that person over technical experience, but a stinking attitude. So sometimes all you need is someone to take a chance on you. And I'm glad that you've been able to afford someone that opportunity, especially for new graduates. It is so darn hard to get your first role. And I think I've talked about that on the podcast before, like how demeaning and discouraging it is to be looking for your first job out of university is just the worst. So thank you for your sending the elevator back down.
Yeah, again, I was fortunate to do it because someone did it for me, and it's a really cool feeling.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you for weaving that theme into this episode. Obviously, I love that.
If I can add a plug at the end,
yes.
I just feel so fortunate to have found myself in the compliance industry. I have never been to conferences or been in spaces with such a welcoming group. So for backstory, I met Mary at the SCCE Compliance and Ethics Institute a few years ago. It was my first time attending. I went by myself, didn't know a single soul, and she was like, hey, do you want to sit with us? Do you want to participate? I mean, everyone in this field has just been so great. So thank you to listeners and people who are participating, because it's just a wonderful community. And, sometimes I feel like a redheaded security world. I'm in compliance. I'm in this weird place. But definitely a lot of love on the compliance side.
Good. Well, I'm glad you found your sense of belonging and felt welcomed by people. I think attending the first conference is hard. And then as soon as you find your little, as Jay calls it, our posse, things become a lot easier, and it's like being in a room of friends as opposed to, but there's nothing wrong with sitting there by yourself. I remember Lady Gaga was performing in Singapore, and several of my friends and I went, and one of the things she asked was, who's attending here alone? That's totally cool. I like to do things on my own too. And so, I wouldn't let the fact that you don't know anyone at certain things. I used to be very codependent. But whether or not you have found or you're going there to socialize, don't let that stop you from going to a conference and absorbing all you can.
Or a Lady Gaga concert.
Exactly. Well, Rachel, that brings us to the end of the episode today. So grateful to have your subject matter expertise, certainly not an area where I excel myself. So really learned a lot and feel like I'm better up to date on the cybersecurity side. I believe you will welcome any of our listeners to invite you to be friends on LinkedIn and continue the conversation. So please do. And I'll just wrap up today's episode by saying, there is a great wealth of information available, and one of the awesome places in compliance where there's a very valuable resource is Corporate Compliance Insights. The founder is Sarah Haddon, and she has very generously continued to make the materials on that website available for everyone for free. So if you haven't come across it before, you'll find a lot of up-to-date articles on areas like cybersecurity, data privacy, anti-corruption, EU whistleblowing law, all sorts. If it's compliance related, you will find it on there. So check out corporatecomplianceinsights.com. Subscribe to the newsletter, and we're very grateful to CCI for being a huge advocate, sponsor, and supporter of ours at Great Women in Compliance. Thank you all. Take good care, and we look forward to seeing you next week.